In light of the end of ordinary time in the next 2 weeks, celebration of Christ the King, our readings and the change in the weather this season, I was reminded of these 3 things in today's readings. You and me will face persecution. All of us are going to die, and the world is going to end. Thoughts of death and great disasters often make me feel uneasy. These 3 topics wrestle my heart. They stir my heart and often cause me anxiety. They remind me of my childhood when I would wonder and question God and others in my life about why we have to die. Or when I would hear doomsday prophecies about the end of the world and be worried about it actually happening. Perhaps many of you had this experience remembering Y2K and felt a similar type of anxiety and uneasiness at the turn of the century, when many were worried about what was going to happen in a new technological era. Perhaps this is a similar feeling that people in Florida and other coastal states get as they prepare for the destruction and upheaval of life caused by hurricanes, as we've seen recently. Today's readings contain this sort of heaviness and anxiety. In the Gospel, Jesus conveys what would be called an apocalyptic or eschatological message, terminology that refers to topics concerning death and judgment, heaven, hell, purgatory, the end of the world. Some of us might know these as what the church calls the last things. When we hear Jesus speak of the last things, it might cause us to listen more intently and fill us with uneasiness because the message is profoundly important. When we hear Jesus speak of all that we see here, the days will come when there will not be a stone left upon another stone that will be thrown down. We're filled with a sense of uneasiness. We can think of what the hearers at this time, the listeners of Jesus, would have felt as they heard their temple would be destroyed. The early Christians, as they hear that they will face persecution. In the historical context and understanding of our gospel today, there exists a sort of triple meaning to Jesus' words. First, Jesus speaks of the destruction of the temple. In the temple, the place where faithful Jewish people would worship, the destruction of which would be, again, a source of great suffering for God's people. The temple had been destroyed throughout the Israelites' history, and Jesus was predicting that it would again be destroyed, and the turmoil this must have caused in their hearts. Jesus is also speaking of the temple of his own body, as we hear this passage proclaimed in other Gospels. He offers up his body for humanity's salvation through his death on the cross. And he is also speaking of the persecution that the people of his time, his followers, would face, and also, I believe, the end of times and the persecution that you and I will face as Christians. And as we have just 2 more weeks left in this church year, today I would like to reflect on this third meaning, the end of time. In today's gospel discourse, Jesus answers the question of when all this destruction will take place. He indicates that various signs will accompany this: persecution, false prophets, wars, insurrections, famines, plagues, and so on. And the challenge with interpreting Jesus' words is that all of these things have taken place throughout history. There's hardly been a time where there hasn't been wars taking place, where strife hasn't existed among humanity. And this begs the question, how can followers of Jesus prepare for these times? First, the church affirms that the world will end, and we cannot explain it away. There will be a finality to history. But I think Jesus uses these signs because he speaks to all people of all ages, and wants to stir within his followers a sense of urgency so that each person is watchful and prepared. Because these signs are constant, Jesus is warning us that the end of our lives can take place at a moment's notice. None of us knows what the future holds. None of his followers knew when they would face persecution. It could happen at a moment's notice. None of them were promised tomorrow if they were to follow Jesus faithfully. And none of us are promised tomorrow if we follow Jesus faithfully. All of us will go through an end of the world. And it might not be some great event. It might not be great persecution like the early Christians faced. But it will happen at the least in our experience of death. And at each moment we must be prepared, because as difficult as it might be for us to hear, we never know when we will depart from this life. Understanding life as temporary and fragile should impact how we live and create a sense of urgency for serving God and Jesus Christ. And this is precisely the message he is communicating and telling his followers they will be persecuted. That life following Jesus requires urgency and faithfulness. And knowing, too, that our meeting Jesus can happen at a moment's notice, we must not delay our conversion, our steadfast trust in God's promises. And if we live with the return of God in mind, we will aim to turn away from and repent of our sin. We will make our relationship with God the priority in our lives, praying more deeply and intimately, appreciating God's gifts and blessings that have been given in abundance. In our interactions with others, we will, knowing that each moment could be our last, we will work to avoid sowing strife and division. We will avoid harsh words and unfair judgments. Instead, the urgency of Jesus' message will challenge us to build up others in love and truth, being a people of compassion, mercy, and love. We will focus less on ourselves and realize that personal accumulation of material wealth, material goods, does not matter as much as we think. And instead we will focus on how we can give of ourselves. We will become a people of loving service, pouring ourselves out for our brothers and sisters in need of love and support through word and action. I believe that if we live with the possibility of the end taking place at any moment, just as Jesus' early followers, we will feel the urgency of Jesus' call to walk the way of love and relationship, proclaiming the gospel by our lives. Knowing that we are held in God's love and that we are transformed by his grace, the end of time, our end in death, all the persecution that we might face, the sufferings of this life, will become less worrisome. If we live with the urgency of the gospel, we truly do have nothing to fear. When God brings us home, because we can have confidence that we are going into the arms of God, who has already communicated his love to us here and now. Today, each of us are invited to accept God's love and mercy with urgency. And this is the only love that can cast out all fear.